On average, every 9 hours, someone is charged with stalking in Scotland.
If a person's determined to stalk another person, nothing's going to stop them.
Anyone can be a stalker. And whilst many know the people they torment, some seek out strangers.
I did not know what was going on. I was just getting bombarded with emails, phone calls. Every time the phone went, it was like, oh, shock.
But there's one thing all stalkers have in common: the need for control over another person's life. That push for power can be terrifying and exhausting for victims.
A lot of our victims end up suicidal because of that hypervigilance, that constant omnipresent, and that psychological impact that this crime imposes on them.
Amanda Morrison moved from Canada to Scotland when her abusive ex-partner started stalking her.
To this day, I answer the phone and I'm prepared for that silence, or for him speaking on the other end, which has occurred as well. I would walk out of my work, look up the street and see a profile that matched his, and my heart would stop. And that just takes me right back to that day, that time frame when I was so incredibly fearful of my life.
But that must be incredibly stressful. Your radar must be on all the time.
I can leave my house in the morning and not worry if there's somebody in the back seat of my car or hiding in a bush if I'm gone for a walk. That I'm not concerned with because I know he's 6,000 miles away and thank goodness too broke to get here. So in that sense, yes. If he was in a different financial situation, I would be that vigilant continuously.
You can be, in a different country and you can still have that an enormous impact on somebody's everyday behaviour and have them thinking, I need to risk assess, what I'm wearing to bed tonight, or I need to be careful about whether I shut the door to clean my teeth, because that sense of the unknown is the most frightening thing.
Stalking is no longer just a physical act. These days, people can be contacted around the clock, and social media makes it easy for stalkers to track and harass their victims.
That myth of the stranger kind of down a dark alley is not the case for the majority of people who are stalked. It's somebody that you know, it's happening day in, day out.
Stalking is recognised as 2 or more incidents that cause someone fear or alarm, be that physical or psychological. However, experts warn that that definition is really broad and that those incidents can be quite subjective.
If those individual behaviours that you're talking about don't look on an incident-by-incident basis like they're frightening, so the classic being sent gifts, but the context behind that, and it's quite intimidating because somebody's showing you, I've had this gift delivered to you, therefore I know where you are. And if you thought that person didn't know where you are, then that's terrifying. But depending on how that's presented to the criminal justice system, it can look really innocuous.
I wouldn't disagree with what Katie says there, and it is a challenge to overcome that, but we are working towards it. So it's about training officers to recognise stalking and harassment in the first place. Within a domestic context, it might be more obvious. We have the new domestic abuse legislation and officers have been trained to identify that, coercive and controlling behaviours. But in a non-domestic context, it can be slightly more challenging, where officers are attending incidents in isolation. It might be, for example, that there's been 25 text messages sent, but all of them are nice in context. It's about recognising it's not about the content of the message, it's about the volume, the impact on the victim.
Police Scotland admits the complexity of the crime means they don't always get it right. But they're confident if someone were to come forward with an allegation, their voice would be heard.
It can happen to anybody, and it's not always, somebody hiding in the bushes. It can be really insidious and has a massive, significant impact on victims.
It was a real intrusion into my life. It was a real harassment, but I didn't know what you could do with that or what you would do with that.
This is James. He's a mental health counsellor whose former client became obsessed with him. We've changed his name and hidden his face, because he's terrified his stalker will start abusing him over the phone and internet again.
I was just getting bombarded. Every time the phone went, it was like, oh, you know, shock. I went out with my wife, we went for a walk. And then when I came back to our home, this person was sat in my garden. It completely shocked me. I just kept saying that you need to go. I made a statement at that point to the police. After about 2 weeks, I got a phone call from the police saying that they had been to visit this person and that they had warned them not to make any more contact with me.
But that warning wasn't taken seriously. The stalker's calls became more frequent and messages darker. Eventually, she was arrested.
I really needed a lot of help to cope with this and to get through this. And I got help from Action on Stalking. I went through the story I've just told you, and at the end of it I said, I'm going to ask you a question that it sounds really stupid, I think. Is this stalking? Because I didn't actually understand or know fully. And they were just like, absolutely, 100%, this is what is known as stalking. And that was the first time I really was like, that's what's happened to me.
Action Against Stalking helps victims regain control over their lives. The charity was set up by Anne Moulds, whose stalker sent her photos and sexual threats for 2 years straight. His punishment was community service.
That was disproportionate to the impact it had in my life. I'd lost weight, my hair fell out, I was living with constant fear.
Anne says the criminal justice system in Scotland doesn't handle cases with enough care.
Stalkers are using the system as their legal agent, stalling for time. Cases are being cancelled all the time. Victims are having to wait 12 times. They're getting ready to appear at court, and then the case has been cancelled and then adjourned to another time. And that's unfair. And that's where the victim feels disempowered, undervalued, and they're starting to feel as they're being victimised by the system.
James knows exactly how that feels.
After about half an hour, this officer of the court came in and just very calmly said, oh, sorry about this, there's been a mistake. The case was adjourned last week and no one had told me. And I couldn't believe the disregard and the lack of understanding that the impact that this was having on me going through the court system. I expected to be empowered by this process that I was going to go through, and not even close. I felt like I was treated as an afterthought.
The maximum penalty for stalking in Scotland is 5 years behind bars, but many offenders receive community sentences. It's then up to the victims to apply for non-harassment orders to deter their stalkers from contacting them again. But these rules, which are very similar to restraining orders, aren't permanent. James's stalker's NHO only lasts until 2026.
I do not understand why it can't be for life.
5 years doesn't really seem that long.
If they'd have said to me, we're thinking of 5 years, I would have said, not long enough. I want this for life.
Are you worried about the day when that harassment order comes to an end?
Already, you know, so what happens on day one after that? You know, I have no protection.